Where there are borders, there will be smugglers. That's an almost universal law of nature. So what about here, at the world's most complicated border? I just walked through the gate of Baarle, a place famous for the checker pattern border shared by the two sister towns, Baarle-Hertog and Baarle-Nassau. Baarle-Hertog is a Belgian exclave surrounded by Holland. There is a point just down the road from me, which is in the Dutch town of Baarle-Nassau, surrounded entirely by the Belgian town Baarle-Hertog, which itself is again surrounded completely by the Dutch. You may have heard of the towns. They've gone viral a couple of times, and you've probably seen a Tom Scott video about it. Where there are borders, there will be smugglers. And the same is true for Holland and Belgium. This is the story of the butter wars.
Hij was een smokkelaar, die diep in de nacht steeds weer zijn smokkelwaar de grens overbracht. Klein was het smokkelloon en groot het gevaar. Zo is het leven van een smokkelaar.
Today, the difference in price between this exact pack of butter bought at Albert Heijn, a supermarket chain in Holland, and bought at the exact same supermarket chain across the border in Belgium is 36 cents. This pack cost me $1.59, and in Belgium it costs $1.95. So that's still an increase of 22%, but it's nowhere near the difference of 70 years ago. In the 1950s, the Dutch government heavily subsidized butter production to stimulate exports. Belgium, trying to protect its dairy farmers, in turn placed high tariffs on butter. So much so that it wasn't profitable for Dutch farmers to export to Belgium, despite the heavy subsidies. All in all, this meant that butter cost about twice as much in Belgium as it did in the Netherlands. That meant smuggling butter was very, very profitable. It all started pretty small. Young lads carrying 25 kilos of butter across the border in a bag in the middle of the night. The bags they used were called pungels, so the young men who did this were called pungelaars. Custom officers would hide in ditches, and when they popped up, the pungelaars would drop their pungels and run. Over time, the smuggling escalated. They started using bikes, then cars. They'd rip out all of the seats except for the drivers so they could fit more butter in them. When the customs set up roadblocks, the smugglers welded V-shaped battering rams to the front of their cars to break through. When the customs started setting up spike strips, the smugglers switched to solid tires. When the customs started shooting at the smugglers, they started armoring their cars. The custom officers would chase the smugglers at 120 kilometers an hour, with their headlights turned off in the middle of the night in the pitch black, just to catch them. The smugglers even started using smoke bombs. But the most infamous trick they used to evade the customs was throwing tailor-made spikes called kruienpoten, or crow's feet, on the road behind them. I'll put a picture up on screen. Kruienpoten cost about half a guilder apiece, and if the customs were chasing them, they'd throw out 1,500 guilders worth of them on the road. Because of that, the local bus would often be stranded on the side of the road the next day, with completely shredded tires. It wasn't just the men that took part either. Women wouldn't be frisked, so they started taping butter to their bodies underneath their dresses to walk across the border with. Of course, they would never confess if they were caught. At one point, a woman was apprehended and put into a room next to a heater. When the butter started melting and visibly dripped down her legs, she still refused to confess. At its peak, tens of millions of kilos of butter were smuggled across the border each year. About a third of Belgium's entire consumption came from smuggling, and about 10% of Holland's total butter production went to smuggling. The amount of smuggled butter that was actually confiscated was multiple orders of magnitude lower. The funny thing is that despite the gargantuan amount of butter being smuggled, nobody really thought of smuggling butter as a crime. The smugglers themselves didn't, but neither did the custom officers. When you heard them talking about it decades later, they all just seemed to think it was some sort of game. Of course, it was still a crime, so officially there were still consequences, but in reality, custom officers received bonuses based on the amount of kilograms of butter they seized, so they were incentivized to let the smugglers go so they could catch them again and receive another bonus. So if you just maintained you were innocent, you would often go scot-free. If you walk through Baarle, you cross the border dozens of times, so it's no surprise that it was a smuggler's paradise. At one point, a smuggler was pushing along a bike filled to the brim with butter when he was stopped by a customs officer. He was shaking in his boots, so the officer took his bike from him and put it against a nearby wall. Unfortunately for him, the wall he parked the bike against happened to be in Baarle-Hertog, not Baarle-Nassau, so he was forced to let the guy go as the contraband was now outside his jurisdiction. In Baarle and other more normal towns along the border between Holland and Belgium, smuggling was a part of life. It was seen as normal. One bar owner in a border town estimated about 80% of his clientele was involved in smuggling somehow or another. There's a statue in the town called the Smokkelaar that was placed there in 1996 to remember the smugglers, and it depicts a pungelaar. It was unveiled by two former custom officers that themselves used to chase the smugglers. That should tell you something about how the Butter Wars, which is the name that was given to the period of massive smuggling, is remembered. Not as a real war, not as a massive crime wave, but as a shared adventure. In 1963, the European Economic Community introduced a common agriculture policy. Belgium started subsidizing its butter producers, and they dropped the tariffs. Of course, there was still some other goods that were being smuggled, like drugs and unlicensed alcohol, but that was seen as a real crime by people. It wasn't part of the game, and so the game ended.
Hij was een smokkelaar.